After the jury wrapped up for the day, Ethan left the courthouse and headed back to his hotel. The judge had sent them off to consider the evidence after a long week. The defendant was back in the Denver County Jail, and he had a couple of days before the jury would return on Monday. Ethan decided to grab a beer at a nearby bar. He settled in and started on his burger when he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Hey, cowboy, buy a girl a drink." He turned around and couldn't believe his eyes. "Sarah? Is that really you?" he asked, feeling a rush of nostalgia. "Yes, it's me," she replied, beaming. He invited her to join him, and they quickly caught up. It had been almost 17 years since they last saw each other. Sarah had been one of his closest friends in high school, part of their tight-knit group until her family moved to Boulder during their senior year. "I've been good," she said. "I graduated from the University of Colorado, got married, got divorced, and now I'm a reporter for the Boulder Daily." "Sorry to hear about the divorce," he said. "What happened?" She shrugged, a hint of frustration in her voice. "He cheated on me multiple times, so I had to let him go. Now he's managing a McDonald's in Grand Junction." "That's rough," he replied. "So what brings you to Denver?" "I'm covering the Wallace trial. I saw you testify. It's heartbreaking about Emily. She didn't deserve to die like that." Her words struck a chord. He thought about Emily and how unfair it was that her life was taken so brutally. "How are you doing, Ethan?" she asked, genuinely concerned. "Considering the mess of the last 16 years, I'm hanging in there," he said with a sigh. "Well, at least you have kids," she reminded him. "Yeah, I'm their dad, but I'm not their biological father," he admitted. "Doesn't matter," she replied. "You're their dad in every way that counts." "Maybe," he said, but it didn't change how he felt about it. Then Sarah surprised him. "I have a confession. Every reporter wants your story, and I want to tell it if you'll let me. I understand if you're hesitant, but no one knows you like I do. We can sign a contract for exclusive rights, and I promise to protect your story." He thought about it for a moment. He'd been approached by various reporters, but something about Sarah made him feel he could trust her. "Okay, you've got a deal. How do we start?" "Let's take a trip back to the old homestead. We have the weekend off, so we can drive back and you can show me where it all happened. I'll ask questions along the way," she suggested. That sounded like a good plan. "Sure, let's do it. I'll meet you at my truck in the parking lot." When they got back on the road, the sun was setting, making the drive more comfortable. Sarah looked great in her professional outfit, a denim skirt and a white blouse that reminded him of their high school days. "Still the same cowboy, huh?" she teased. He laughed. "Yeah, some things never change." They started the interview, and he shared stories from their high school days. He explained how Chris, Emily, and he were inseparable until everything changed. After graduating, he proposed to Emily, and they got married. Chris went into the Marines, while he took a different path. "You didn't know Emily was cheating?" she asked. "Not at all. She was careful. I only found out when I received a picture from Bob after I was away for training. It was a shot of him with a big fish, Chris beside him, and Emily with her hand on Chris's shoulder, looking too cozy." "That must have hurt," Sarah said softly. "It did. It shattered everything I thought I knew," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah turned off the recorder for a moment, lost in thought. He could see she was processing everything. He realized that this journey back was more than just revisiting old memories. It was about confronting the truth and finding closure. As they drove on, he felt a mix of hope and sadness, but mostly a sense of relief that he was finally sharing his story with someone who cared. On a late Saturday night, Ethan returned home to find Emily in tears. She was upset because her grandmother's ring had gone missing. He asked her the usual questions to comfort her, then pulled the rings out of his pocket. She was shocked. "How did you get those?" she asked. He explained that a trusted friend found them and sent them to him, keeping Jessica's name out of it to avoid hurting her feelings. He added, "Just don't leave them in the ashtray next time Chris visits." Her eyes widened, and she cried, expressing how much she loved him. "Sorry," he said, realizing he had misread her emotions. "It's okay," she replied. "I've heard worse." At that moment, Ethan sensed their relationship was over. He didn't have concrete proof of her infidelity, just an unsettling gut feeling. He needed to dig deeper, starting with DNA tests to find out if the kids were his. He bought surveillance gear, cameras, audio recorders, and even bugged their phones. Everything was saved on his home server and backed up to the cloud, all while she was out shopping. The DNA test was easy to arrange. One of his clients in Denver runs a lab for this. He collected samples from the kids and himself without Emily knowing. When Chris came over that Sunday, he dozed off in his chair, so Ethan swabbed his cheek. A week later, the lab results arrived. A 99.9% chance Chris was the father of both kids. That meant Emily had been unfaithful for at least 16 years. Did you have any idea? Sarah asked, surprised. Not at all, he replied. She never gave me a reason to doubt her. Everything seemed normal. About a week after installing the surveillance, he got his first video proof. He was in Oklahoma City for a couple of days, and the kids were with his parents. That night, Emily called Chris over. He logged into his server and watched them in their bed. It was painful, but their conversation hurt even more. What were they saying? Sarah whispered. Just give me a moment, he replied, focusing on the dark road ahead. He knew Chris had a troubled past, and this area felt dangerous. He turned on his high beams and pulled his gun from the glove box, feeling ready to keep going. When they reached his driveway, he noticed a Department of Social Services car parked outside. Who's that? Sarah asked. That's our security team, he explained. Since Chris got arrested, they've been keeping an eye on us. Some of his associates tried to set the house on fire once, but we caught them. Now, we have 24-hour security. After parking in the garage, they approached the officer in the car. He seemed surprised to see Ethan. Ethan, I thought you were still in Denver, he said, shaking his hand. The jury went to deliberation this afternoon. This is Sarah Burns from the Boulder Daily. She's staying with me this weekend. The officer tipped his hat to Sarah. Nice to meet you, ma'am. Things have been calm since Chris's crew was taken down. My shift ends soon, so you'll see my replacement. Thanks for looking out for us, Ethan said. Once inside, he brewed coffee and gave Sarah a tour of the house, built in 1866. Over the years, it had been renovated, but some original features remained. It had 5 bedrooms, a 3-car garage, and a wraparound porch. There were separate rooms for both kids and a master suite. Emily even had a sewing room. He offered Sarah the master bedroom since it had its own bathroom, but she insisted they share the bed. The bed's big enough for both of us. We're adults, she said with a grin. He hesitated but agreed. They settled in the living room, ready to talk. I want to hear everything, she said. Just let me call the kids first, he replied, dialing his parents to check in. They were excited to see Sarah and planned to meet for lunch the next day. He grabbed a stack of DVDs from his study. These might help, he said, handing one to her. Her eyes widened. How many recordings do you have? A lot, he replied. Some are from the house, some from my office. He started the first DVD, warning her it was tough to watch. The video showed Emily and Chris in their bed. At one point, Emily took off her rings and tossed them into the ashtray. To hell with his great-grandmother's ring, Emily said, laughing. He glanced at Sarah, who was fighting tears as he fast-forwarded through the explicit parts. Finally, he paused when they were lying on the bed. Emily said, I'm pregnant again, baby. Chris replied, Didn't you take your pills? Yeah, but I might have missed a day or two, she said casually. Chris groaned. You know the rules, no condoms. I can't handle another pregnancy. I've had 3 already, and the last one nearly killed me, Emily shot back. They discussed options, and it became clear Emily was committed to Chris. He turned off the video, feeling crushed. Sarah wiped her eyes. I can't believe you lived like this for 17 years. Could you stay with someone who betrayed you? He asked. No, she admitted. He called contacts to set up meetings with an attorney and a federal investigator in Denver. His dad assured him he'd support his decision. Chris was bad news, and he needed to protect his kids. They devised a plan. He'd tell them he had a business trip while his parents took them to their place. When he called Bob, he was eager to see Sarah. A few minutes later, his secretary announced Chris was in the lobby. He placed his pistol on the desk and turned on the recorder. Chris sauntered in with a smirk. I hear you saw Brad Carter today. What of it? If you're thinking of divorcing Emily, forget it. I won't let you drag me into court, he replied. Why, Chris? We were friends, he said, trying to keep calm. How long has this been going on? He pressed. Since prom night, he sneered. Whenever you were gone, I was there, even on your wedding day. Now you're saying she's mine, he whispered, shocked. 9 months later, Bob was born while you were stationed overseas. I was at your place most nights. He glared at Chris, his mind racing. And the pregnancies you used my insurance for? He shrugged, unfazed. When Ethan arrived, he saw Emily's car parked outside, but Chris's truck was missing. He stepped inside with his gun drawn. You're back early, Emily said, her eyes wide with surprise. Is Chris here? He asked. Why would he be? She replied, trying to act innocent. Maybe he's here to plan my accident, he shot back. Her face paled. Ethan, I'm so sorry, she whispered. He put the DVD into the player, and Chris's voice filled the room. He could see the guilt wash over Emily. Ethan, it's not what you think. We can fix this, she pleaded. Fix this, he scoffed. It's over. He took off his grandmother's ring from her finger and handed her his wedding ring. Now get out. She hesitated, but he tossed her purse at her. Just then, his dad's truck pulled in, followed closely by Chris's. Emily smirked, thinking she had the upper hand. Let's see how this plays out, she said smugly. It would be easier if you cooperated, she taunted. Are you really going to do this? He asked her. In a heartbeat, she replied. Just then, Dad blocked Chris's truck with his own and stepped out with his rifle in hand. What are you doing, Adams? Chris shouted. I'm enforcing a restraining order, Dad replied firmly. What kind of restraining order? Chris asked, confused. The one that keeps you and Emily 500 feet away from my family and property, Dad said. Chris hesitated as 2 police cars with flashing lights arrived. 4 state troopers stepped out with their guns drawn. We'll handle it from here, Mr. Adams, one officer said. Dad lowered his weapon, and the officer handed Chris a restraining order. Is that her? The officer asked, pointing at Emily. Dad shook his head. The officer handed the paper to Emily. Mrs. Taylor, you must stay 500 feet away from the Adams family and their property. If you don't comply, you'll be taken into custody. Do you understand? Yes, Emily mumbled. Excuse me, officer, Ethan interjected. I'd like you to take Emily and Mr. Wallace into custody. And why would I do that? The officer asked. He hit play on the DVD, letting them hear the threat Emily made against him and the kids. The officer shot her a stern look and pulled out handcuffs. Mrs. Taylor, you're under arrest. Turn around and put your hands behind your back, he instructed. After cuffing her and reading her rights, he called for another officer to arrest Chris. You'll pay for this, idiot, Emily hissed as they led her away. You're all going to pay. A van from a local TV station arrived just as Chris was being taken away. Do you know who I am? Chris yelled. Yeah, I know and I don't care. You're under arrest, the officer replied. I'll get your badge for this. Chris shouted, furious. Ethan realized he should have mentioned their plan to eliminate him, but he had no evidence on hand. The news van moved aside so patrol cars could leave. A reporter approached him as his dad walked over. Mr. Adams, why was Commissioner Wallace arrested? She asked. Making death threats is a crime, even for well-known politicians like Chris and his married girlfriend, he said. I need to take care of my kids now. He walked away with his dad, leaving the reporter behind. Chris's reputation was in shambles. His next stop was his parents' house to explain everything. He dreaded telling his kids that Uncle Chris was really their biological father, but the truth needed to come out. At first, they struggled to believe it, but the DNA test confirmed it. I don't care what that paper says, Jessica declared. You're my dad, and you always will be. I agree, Bob added. He felt proud as they hugged and shed a few tears. After saying goodbye, he headed home to pack for a few days in Denver. The next day, he met with Adam Smith, a lawyer known for winning tough cases. He had called a meeting with 3 men he'd contacted, and he was surprised to see them all there. Sorry to spring this on you, Mr. Adams, Adam said. But after that last video, we thought it best to meet together. John Hancock, a prosecutor, took charge. "Mr. Adams, I'm sorry for everything you've been through. We have a lot of evidence against Chris Wallace, including drug trafficking, human trafficking, and 6 murders. Your wife is involved too, especially in prostitution." Kurt Torres, a Colorado Ranger captain, explained the sheriff's department was temporarily replaced by Rangers and DEA agents due to corruption. Adam then told him he would push for an annulment based on Emily's criminal actions. "If that doesn't work, we'll file for infidelity and mental cruelty," he said. After an hour of discussion, Adam handed him a DVD with footage of Emily's actions. "I'm not going to sugarcoat it, Mr. Adams," John concluded. "We're seeking the death penalty for Wallace. Your wife might get life without parole, but be careful, your lives are still in danger." "I hear you," he replied. They shook hands and parted ways. His mind was racing. The man he trusted was involved in drugs and murder, and his wife was part of it too. How had he missed all of this for 17 years? Suddenly, he got a frantic call from Bob. "Dad, come home now," he shouted. "What's going on?" he asked, alarmed. "Just come home," he insisted. He drove as fast as he could, and when he arrived, ambulances and police cars surrounded his house. He rushed inside as paramedics wheeled out a gurney. One of them pulled back the sheet, revealing Emily's face. "I'm sorry, Mr. Adams," the paramedic said. "She's gone." He wasn't as upset as he thought he'd be. He saw Chris on another gurney, alive but injured. His kids and dad stood safely to the side. He hugged them tightly, relieved they were unharmed. It had been a long time since Ethan made breakfast for anyone, especially a woman, and the smell wafting from the kitchen was downright incredible. "This is definitely going to win my mom's approval," he joked, enjoying the aroma. "Didn't you cook like this for your ex?" he asked playfully. Sarah laughed. "Nah, my ex was all about fast food." "Dig in." Ethan savored every bite, knowing they had a busy day ahead. "So, what's on the agenda?" he asked between mouthfuls. "First, I want to see your family," she replied. "Then we'll visit Emily's mother for some insight. If we have time, we might swing by the cemetery, and we really need to shop. Your pantry is practically bare." He devoured his meal, pausing only to sip his coffee and praise her cooking. It had been years since he had a breakfast this good. He felt like he'd died and gone to heaven. After finishing, he hugged Sarah tightly, thanking her for the amazing meal. "I guess I better get ready," he said. She teased, "Do you need a shave?" He chuckled as he headed to the bathroom. As he showered and shaved, his thoughts kept drifting to Sarah. In less than a day, he was falling for her just like he had in high school. Could it be that Sarah and he were meant to be? For the first time in months, he felt genuinely happy. Sarah, now dressed casually in jeans and a t-shirt, grabbed her laptop bag and purse. "Ready to go?" she asked with a smile. They arrived at his parents' house, where the kids came barreling out as soon as he parked. He introduced everyone to Sarah, and they stepped inside. Sarah explained her plan and asked to speak with each of them individually. His mom went to the kitchen to start preparing dinner while his dad and he chatted in the living room. Sarah began her conversations with Jessica, then moved on to his dad. His dad and he filled the time discussing hunting, fishing, and soccer, carefully sidestepping anything related to Emily and Chris. After a couple of hours, Sarah asked to speak with his dad. He took the kids outside to kick a soccer ball around. After about an hour, Sarah finished up and joined them outside until lunch was ready. The kids connected with her, and she genuinely seemed to enjoy their company. When Mom called them in for lunch, he felt a wave of happiness wash over him. After they ate, they said their goodbyes. Jessica hugged him tightly and whispered, "Daddy, if you don't ask her to marry you, I'll kick your butt." He laughed and promised to think about it. "How did the interviews go?" he asked Sarah as they left. "They went well," she said. "I know you have trust issues, so let me explain. I interviewed everyone privately to get honest answers. I wanted them to feel free to speak their minds." He appreciated her approach. "Did you learn anything new?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. Jessica mentioned that Chris had been making advances toward her for a while. He felt his blood boil. "Your family really loves you," she continued. "They had their suspicions about Emily, but didn't want to interfere. If they'd known more details, they would have said something." "What else did you find out?" he pressed. I experienced what it's like to be part of a close-knit family, and I loved it. Thanks for including me in your life, she said. He smiled, glad that the kids had taken to her. When they arrived at Emily's mother, Samantha's apartment, he asked, "Do you want to interview her privately too?" Sarah shook her head. "No, I think you should talk to her." Samantha opened the door slowly, moving with caution due to health issues and the lingering grief from losing Emily. "How are you feeling?" he asked as he hugged her. "I'm fine, Ethan. Thanks for asking," she said, returning the embrace. Sarah smiled at her, and Samantha complimented, "You're still as beautiful as you were in high school." They settled down, and he explained what Sarah was doing. "What can I tell you?" Samantha asked. Sarah dove into questions about Emily and Chris's affair, which had spanned their marriage. Samantha looked embarrassed. "Yes, I knew," she admitted. "I should have told you, Ethan. You didn't deserve this." "How long have you known?" he pressed. "Since the beginning," she replied. "When you were in Japan, Chris practically lived with Emily. They were careful when your family was around. I warned her it was a mistake, but she didn't listen." "Why did she marry me if she wanted to be with Chris?" he asked, feeling the weight of her words. "She loved you both, but in different ways," Samantha explained. "You were her stable rock, while Chris was the wild adventure." He felt the bitterness rise within him. Samantha continued, "I didn't know about the abortions until she told me. I warned her she'd get caught, but she brushed it off." After a lengthy conversation, he promised Samantha she could visit the kids anytime. As they left, Sarah and he talked about the arrangements he made for Emily. "It felt right to honor her that way," he replied, grappling with the complexity of emotions swirling inside him. On their way to the cemetery, Sarah asked, "Do you ever think about what you want moving forward?" "Yeah," he admitted, feeling the weight of the past pressing down. "I love you too, Sarah Burns," Ethan said, warmth flooding his chest. She looked at him, biting her lip nervously. "Take me home and make love to me, cowboy," she teased. "Or I might just pounce on you right here." "Let's keep this under control," he joked, trying his best John Wayne impression. She smiled, took his hand, and led him to the parking lot. "Take me home now," she purred. As soon as they got into the car, she leaned in for a kiss. "Thank goodness for tinted windows." "Are we almost home?" he asked. "Good," she replied softly. Once they parked in the garage, they rushed inside. Later, as they lay in bed, her nestled in his arms, he thought about how just 36 hours ago, he felt broken. Now, with Sarah beside him, he felt hope. He knew he wanted to take the next step, but worried she might think he was rushing things. But then he thought, what the heck? Full speed ahead. "A penny for your thoughts," she said, looking up at him. "I just don't want this to ever end," he confessed. "Me neither," she replied. "What do you suggest we do about it?" he asked. He opened the nightstand and pulled out a small box. Inside was his great-grandmother's engagement ring. Sarah's eyes widened as he explained its history. "This ring symbolizes my love for you," he said. "It's been passed down for generations. If you'd prefer a new ring, I understand." With tears in her eyes, she said, "Yes, I'll marry you and wear your great-grandmother's ring with pride. But there's one condition," she added. "A condition?" he asked, surprised. "Promise you'll cancel the vasectomy. I want a house full of kids." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and they kissed before making love, then drifted off to sleep in each other's arms. The next morning, he woke to the smell of bacon. Sarah was making her legendary breakfast. After they ate, they packed for their trip to Denver and shared another shower, leading to more passion. He called the kids to share their news. "Woohoo!" Bob shouted when he told him they were getting married. Jessica was just as excited. "Good for you, Daddy. You've got a real winner." "Congratulations," his dad said, welcoming Sarah to the family. "Thank you, Mr. Adams," she replied. "Call me Dad," he laughed. "Okay, Dad," she said, giggling. "Have you set a date?" his mom asked. "Not yet," Sarah replied. "I have things to finish in Boulder first, but it'll be soon." After they wrapped up their calls, they hopped in the truck. Something Sarah said nagged at him. "What are your plans?" "Long-distance relationships can be tricky," he said. Did you know Jake Carson is retiring as editor-in-chief of the Daily Record? She asked. I didn't, he replied. I sent my resume last week before we met, and they want to talk to me about the job. He won't retire for 3 months, and I need 2 months to wrap things up in Boulder. What if you don't get the job? He asked. I'll find a way to stay here, she teased. The board wants someone with my experience, and I have great ideas to improve circulation. Sounds like you've got it all planned out, he said. I like to be prepared, she replied, wrapping her arms around his neck. No matter what, I'll support you 100%. I'd rather spend all my time with you, he said. After closing up the house, he picked some flowers from the garden. Mind if we stop somewhere? He asked. Oh, do you have a girlfriend hiding somewhere? She joked. You know better, he replied. They arrived at the cemetery, and he placed the flowers on Emily's grave. By the way, Emily, Sarah and I are getting married, he said. Sarah added. And if the kids are okay with it, I plan to adopt them. After saying their goodbyes, he asked, Do you really want to adopt the kids? Absolutely, she replied. They deserve a mother they can trust. They drove back to Denver mostly in silence. At the hotel, Sarah suggested, Why don't you move into my room? The paper is paying for mine until this is over. At least let me pay part of the bill, he insisted. You can cover our dates, she replied playfully. He checked out and moved in with Sarah. That night, they enjoyed a great steak dinner, danced, and had another unforgettable night together. The next morning, they got to the courthouse early. The jurors began deliberating right away. By 1:30, they had reached a verdict. Chris sat there, emotionless. We have a verdict, Your Honor, the foreman announced. The judge read it aloud, confirming that the jury found Chris guilty on all charges. Ethan looked at Chris, feeling relief. He glared at Ethan. What are you looking at? He spat. I'm looking at a worthless piece of crap, Ethan shot back. Finally, the nightmare was over, and he looked forward to a new chapter with Sarah.